Welcome to the Back on Track podcast with me, Sam West. In every episode, I interview someone who's changed, recovered, or become successful after having faced real adversity in their life. What's more, at the end of every episode, guests give you a few bits of advice which you can use to improve your own life too. On today's episode is mental health advocate and author Claire Eastham. Claire began suffering with social anxiety from a young age, but unfortunately these feelings went undiagnosed. That was until she suffered a severe panic attack during a job interview, which caused her to really look into what was going on. It took Claire a whole year to recover from this breakdown, and it was a process that involved therapy, medication, and writing a blog to express her feelings. The blog was called We're All Mad Here, and it was so successful that it was actually turned into a book by the same name. Since then, I'm really pleased to say that Claire has gone from strength to strength, writing another fantastic book and doing other great work as a mental health ambassador. So, without further ado, let's find out what happened by listening to Claire's story from start to finish. Claire, first of all, I just want to say a massive thank you for taking the time to appear on the podcast. I really appreciate it. How are you doing? How's everything going?
I'm good, thanks. Apart from boiling my ass off, I'm very good.
It's too hot, isn't it?
That's the good thing. I mean, the one good thing, because I'm not a fan of the heat, because I'm like paler than a ghost. But the one good thing of it is I'm not anxious really at the moment because I can't think. It's like my brain's melted.
Exactly. It kind of slows us down, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But when it's freezing cold, it wakes the mind up a bit too much. Well, glad to hear that, apart from the heat, that you're doing well. Claire, in the podcast, I tend to sort of go from start to finish in a guest story so that listeners can really, really understand it in full. And I was doing a bit of research before doing this interview to try and find out sort of when you first started feeling these feelings of social anxiety. And I think that although it went undiagnosed for 10 years, I think that you mentioned before that actually you started feeling some of these things at a very young age. I think one of the things that I read was like at family gatherings, you would feel sort of quite nervous because, and it resonated with me because as a kid, you're kind of expected to talk to lots of different adults. The attention's quite on you. So I found that quite interesting. And so, I'm just wondering if you could tell us a bit about that. And if, looking back now, you think that sort of they were the first instances of the social anxiety, although it was obviously undiagnosed at that stage.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for doing that research.
That's okay.
It's always flattering when people take the time to do that, so thank you.
No problem.
It wasn't diagnosed until a lot later, but I think I was probably about 8. When I look back, I can see a lot of the signs that I now know are like kind of highlighting to being social anxiety. Before going to family parties, barbecues or whatnot, I remember my stomach would be off. I'd get stomachache or I'd feel sick, or even though it was like family, it's always extended family. If it was my grandma, I was like, yeah, whatever, it's my grandma. But it's like aunties and uncles and friends of the family would go. And it's kind of like, it's like you say, I call it a pressure to perform. Because kids are almost expected to entertain the adults in a way. They get all this attention in a very short amount of time, and they say, like, what have you been up to? Why don't you show them this dance? Why don't you tell them about this? And it's such an overwhelming amount of spotlight. I used to freeze up. I was like a rabbit in headlights. And most of the time I'd try and hide or spend it in the kitchen with my grandma, who'd get slowly and slowly more pissed whilst chain smoking and slag off the rest of the family. So it was really
perfect environment to be in. Yeah. I found that really interesting, and it's interesting for me because I think I actually went the other way. Like as a kid, I felt very confident and all the rest of it, and as I've got more anxious as I get older, kind of those events, not necessarily with family now, but where I'm expected to talk to a lot of different people, I feel more anxious now than I did as a kid. So it's kind of interesting that we went slightly different ways on that. But I also read that when you went into secondary school, that there were also sort of some feelings of social anxiety there as well. And I think that's really understandable because, everyone knows, secondary school can be a place where people can very often not be very nice or not say nice things, and friendship groups can be very cliquey, etc., etc. So I'm just wondering, did you feel quite anxious in some settings when you went to secondary school, and if you could tell us a bit about that as well?
Secondary school, I think for a lot of people, social anxiety was like this, like ground zero, or like the trigger. I think like stuff that was always there. You go to secondary school, and I was liking it to prison. I really do. Like, we tend to say that kids don't have problems. I'm like, yeah, they fucking do. And it's like, you go, everyone has to wear the same uniform, whether it looks good on you or not. You have to have, scheduled everything. You have to try and find a click very, very quickly so you're not left on your own. And suddenly there's a correct way of doing things rather than what's always felt natural to you. Or it's that intensity. You will sit here, it's like, I always thought it'd be okay if I was with my friends, and then you get sat like boy, girl, so with people you don't even know. And then it always amuses me, like, school is the only place in the world where you will be spoken to like that. Like, that will never happen to you as an adult. You won't get someone in the office saying, you're ugly.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, at school, like, it makes me laugh. I was like, that happens all the time. Or just the cruelty of kids. Kids can be absolute dicks, and I'm sure I was as well. But I think, when you add a bit of puberty, and I thought dose of puberty to that, and it's like an absolute recipe for trauma, I think, in some capacity.
I think it definitely is, and I've actually heard people say before that that prison is essentially like secondary school but with lethal violence. It's that kind of vibe, and it can be. Yeah, it can be that traumatizing for people, and especially if you've got sort of the seeds of social anxiety growing there. But another thing I found incredible about your story is, obviously, as we mentioned, it went undiagnosed for 10 years, but you went through secondary school, and then you got a degree, and then you got a master's degree, and then you went on to work in a publishing company. So really sort of doing really well, although you had these feelings of anxiety there. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us about that, how you managed to sort of achieve so much and do so well academically, and then get into a good job whilst obviously battling with feelings that you might not have understood at that early stage.
Funnily enough, people with anxiety, social anxiety, OCD, like with it more on the kind of anxious spectrum, do tend to be very successful, because it also is linked to perfectionism and discipline, and it's control, I think, is the word. I figured out at an early age that if I do this and this, I will be successful academically. It doesn't matter if I like it or not. It doesn't matter if I'm happy. This is the rule for life. This is what I have to do to be happy. If I do all these things, then everything will be okay. Without really thinking why I was doing it. So I just noticed that the more kind of success I got academically, the more praise I was given. And like a lot of people with social anxiety, you place great value in approval. And it's the safety of approval, really. If you do things that other people think are impressive, then you won't lose everything, or everything will be okay if you keep achieving these goals. It sounds really complicated the way I'm wording it. I don't think I'm wording it very well, but
no, it doesn't at all. I can, it is kind of a comfort, a protection. If you're performing well in that area of your life, nobody's going to question you about it. Nobody's going to put you under pressure, and it just, it relieves pressure in some way, I guess.
I can't possibly be, falling apart because look how successful I am.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm definitely not suffering with anxiety. Look at all I'm achieving.
I'm fine. I'm totally fine. Like shaking. Like.
Exactly. Trust me. But yeah, I found that really, really encouraging, and I think that would be quite inspiring for quite a few people listening, especially some younger people who are going through university or whatever, and have their own struggles. That
don't do what I did. Sorry to cut a bit, but Christ, if you are, don't do what I did. Like,
what do you mean in that sense?
You can absolutely still be successful if you live with mental illness. I truly believe that. I'll talk about that more in my second book. But I ignored it. I didn't get diagnosed until I was 25. So I got through it by white knuckling it, which I was lucky that I succeeded. But then I had a breakdown when it caught with me to age 25. But there are other ways you can have it, talk about it, get help for it, and still succeed academically, I think. So just don't do what I did and ignore it, really.
Absolutely, yeah, and I advocate that a lot on on this channel for to seek out the right help at the right time. But it can be really difficult, and I remember when I first started feeling like really sort of chronic feelings of anxiety. I didn't even really understand where I had to go to get that help, who I should talk to, etc. etc. So it can be really confusing, and it can take people a lot of time to to get to the stage where they want to get some help. And Claire, you mentioned there the breakdown, and that was actually the next thing that I wanted to touch on. I think, as you mentioned, it was at the age of sort of 24 or 25. And I think you were going for a promotion or something at the publishing house where you were working, might have been something like that. And you actually had a full-blown panic attack, and it might have been, the first one that you'd really experienced, at least of that severity. And I'm just wondering if you could talk us through what happened and how it felt, and all the rest of it.
It was a hot day that day as well. So it's like, I can remember that was like the final straw, I think, the heat.
Yeah.
I remember because I was going in for this meeting for a potential promotion. I'd done a lot of prep, like far too much prep. I think normal people would just think, I'll think of a few pointers. I wrote like 25 questions down they could possibly ask me.
Wow.
And then wrote the answers and then rehearsed it like I was in a play. Like that's the level of I would say commitment, but I don't think it's commitment. I think it's obsession. Like that's what I thought that was normal. Like up until I got diagnosed, I thought all of my behavior was normal.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to script conversations and stuff. Talk about that later. But yeah, that's the kind of thing that I did. And anyway, so I went in, and after it had been 10 years of ignoring my brain, really, I mean, the last year in particular, now I know that my body was sending some very clear signs that something wasn't right. Insomnia, heart palpitations, sweating, nausea, a feeling of dread, irritability. Like that's one that's a misconception that often gets missed. Like highly irritable all the time for no reason.
Yeah.
And I went into that meeting, and I knew as I was walking in the room that this isn't right, because there's a weird fog in front of my eyes, but I'll just sit down, it'll be all right, crack on. And I had what I now know was a huge panic attack. It was the first one I'd ever had. And I didn't care anymore. I didn't care about embarrassing myself. I didn't care about making a scene, which for me is unheard of. Like that's the last thing I'd ever want to do. My friends used to joke that I'd get hit by a bus and still be like, oh, honestly, I'm fine. I'll walk to the hospital.
Yeah.
So it kind of shows you the intensity of it. Like I remember my heart, it was pounding so hard, it was painful. I couldn't lift my arms, they were numb. My tongue felt like it's swollen up. It was dry. I couldn't breathe. That's obviously the most distressing of all symptoms for panic, really. And I just stood up, and in my madness, my brain decided that the way to get out was to use a really posh voice, and which is a shock for everyone because I'm from Bolton. So it was like, I'm so sorry, I have the neurovirus and I must leave at once, and then ran out the room.
Wow.
That was a proper breakdown. When people say you had a breakdown, I'm like, no, really.
I genuinely did. Do you want to know what I said?
Yeah.
It just sounds awful. And I read as well that I think it took you sort of a year to fully recover from that, from what must have been a really traumatic experience. And I'm just wondering sort of what that period of recovery involved. Did you have to sort of start some therapy? Was there some medication? What things helped? Yeah, if you could just talk us through all of that.
All of the above. There was a lot of kind of digging down, as it were. It does make me really sad because knowing what I know now, and I think knowledge when it comes to mental health is so important, because when you're ill, the last thing you want is to be confused as well. Especially when, this was like 2011, 2012, it wasn't that there wasn't enough information, it just wasn't accessible to everybody. And it wasn't in language that was jargon free or that I could understand. So it was really scary to be feeling the way that I was feeling and have nobody be able to reassure me, really. So you do think that your life is over. You do think that you've ruined it. And I kind of had to get myself out of it the long and hard way. The most important thing I did initially was forcibly, I might add, was signed off work for 2 months. Like my GP was quite adamant with that.
Yeah.
She said, you can't work. Because I thought, being me, like trying to get back on a kind of a path, like, okay, I'll have 2 weeks off. And I go, and she's like, absolutely not.
Yeah,
like, you need a proper rest. In the same way that if you'd had an operation or you'd broken a bone, like you might want to go back and do what you would normally do, but you can't. That's been taken away from you. So I rested. It gave my nervous system a break. And during that time, I tried to learn as much about my condition as I could. And that was kind of the basis for the blog eventually. Like, I started taking medication, which is sertraline. I've been taking that since, so like 10 years, really.
Wow.
I didn't see a therapist until much, much later because I just was too, I don't like to use this word, but I was too hysterical.
Yeah.
I wasn't ready to start digging down into, why do you think this happened? Like, I can't go there until I've healed this.
Yeah.
And because I was having panic attacks left, right, and center, and again, knowing what I now know about panic, it's because it identified the workplace, or anything that identified the workplace as danger.
Yeah.
Because that's where it had one. Like, you almost died in that meeting room, and my amygdala really believed that. So I had to do what's called exposure therapy. Wow. Which always makes me laugh, this, because it's not like if you're afraid of heights, like jump out of a plane. Like, it doesn't mean that's trauma. Like, it's really, really small stepping stones. The way you can communicate with the amygdala, the only way you can communicate with it is when you're in a state of panic or high adrenaline.
Right.
So, but it will always win in an argument, always. Like, you can't be in a situation where you think you're going to die and be like, you know what, honestly, I think it's all right, because the amygdala wants you to survive more than it cares about you making a tit of yourself.
Yeah, it's the instinctive part of your brain. It's survival. It takes over, doesn't it? Yeah.
100%. So, long story short, I thought I'm going to have to do this in baby steps. And I did. I practiced being in an office. Like, at first, I practiced it up on a dining room table at my parents' house to trigger an attack. Breathe through it, work through it. And it was just for me accepting that this feels horrendous. This is the most frightened I've ever been. But nothing bad is going to happen. Like, nothing. You'll feel this bad and then it'll go. And then the next one, it'll be easier. And then the next one after that will be easy. But bear in mind, I was doing this without anybody being able to tell me that for sure. I was kind of just going off stuff that I'd read and like hoping for the best. And it turned out that it was, it really, really worked for me in terms of panic.
That's incredible. I mean, it's such a brave thing to have to do, to have to expose yourself to the very thing that makes you feel panic. For that to be the route that you have to take to get better, I think you have to be really brave and really, really strong to get through that. And obviously, you had to, the medication, I'm sure, played a role in that as well. And it goes to show that both sides, therapy and medication, play different roles and help in different ways. So yeah, both of those can be useful to people depending on what they're going through. But there was something really, really good to come out of this, and I think this can often happen with people that suffer from mental illness, because you started your blog, which is called, I believe, We're All Mad Here, which was subsequently turned into a book by the same name. And I think you started this during this period of recovery, and I don't know, that I felt like that was quite inspiring for me, because it was like, if you hadn't touched that rock bottom point, those sort of great things which have obviously helped a lot of people since, they might not have come to be, So yeah, I'm wondering if you could talk to us about your decision to start the blog, because it's a big thing, to share your experiences publicly. So I'm wondering how you felt about that, and sort of how it was received, and then obviously how the book went.
I think in an absolute storm of confusion and fear, it was my kind of anchor.
Yeah.
It was a kind of something to focus on at first, because it wasn't a blog at first. It was just me typing stuff into like Word, and like, it doesn't matter. Like, you don't have to censor yourself, just start writing and see what comes out, because it just felt like I was drawing out poison.
Yeah.
Whilst I was in recovery, I was saying, like, obsessive research, trying to find out what was going on in my head. I became so unbelievably frustrated by the amount of clinical and medical jargon. I'm like, I don't understand, and I've now got to go back and kind of decode all this. And then once you do it, you're like, oh, basically it means I'm afraid. Why don't you just say that? So I thought, I'm going to start writing some of this down, and anything that works or any reasonably positive experience, I'll publish, because I'm quite particular about it's not that I don't go there with the darker stuff, like I do, but I don't think all of it needs to be published. I don't think, the amount of stuff I read that said, this has ruined my life, I've never worked again. And it's like but they don't go back and update that.
Yeah, it's just
I, 27, there. Might now be living a really happy life, but that piece of, text is there in cyberspace for somebody who's vulnerable to find. And I'm not going to do that to someone. But the more I wrote, the more it just became this incredibly positive experience, because I could keep looking back and be like, when I was having moments of I'm afraid of getting really ill again, you could be like, well, literally look how far you've come with this.
Yeah, that's incredible. And could you talk to us about sort of the feeling that you got when you were contacted? Because I think you were contacted by a publisher, right, who said, love the blog, we want to turn it into a book. I'm just imagining if that was me, I'd be over the moon, like sort of exposing this intimate part of you, which is obviously helping people. And then, to have a publisher become interested in it, that must have been like an incredible milestone moment for you.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I thought it was one of my mates messing about.
Yeah, so would I, yeah.
Right, yeah. Of course, yeah, you want to turn it into a book. Who is this? Kind of. But it's one of those where I kind of like block things out because I'm so convinced it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So I didn't have that moment until I got the contract and they said, we'll start breaking this up into chapters and what do you think about this? And I was like, this is amazing. Like I find it hard to kind of give myself praise at the best of times, but wow, it was the editor, really. I had a really strong relationship with the editor, Rachel, who just really took a chance on me and said they're trying to write more books like this. There's a lot of them out there now, that are more personable, a bit of humour in them, sweary, that kind of thing, rather than just textbooks. Like, because back, when mine came out, it was still quite heavily textbooks when it came to mental health.
That's amazing. No, I can imagine that must have been life changing in some ways, having that kind of interest in something you'd been working on. And one thing I wanted to ask you about, because this is something that I battled with. Before I started this podcast, I'd confided in some of my close friends about like the mental illness that I'd suffered and all the rest of it, but the decision to sort of go public with it, if you like, was something that I really battled with, and it caused me a hell of a lot of anxiety, really. And I think sometimes it still does. People think that because you're a mental health advocate and you talk about these things on these platforms that you have no issue in doing so. But at times I do still feel quite anxious and quite vulnerable, I guess, in some ways, in terms of how that might be received by some people. And I'm wondering, did you have that same battle in the beginning in terms of thinking, right, I'm putting this out there? And also, how has it been since? Do you feel very comfortable doing so, or are there sort of times when it causes you a degree of anxiety?
First of all, a question for you. When you say, you feel anxious about how it will be received, do you mean by people in general or people you know?
It's a really interesting one. So people in general, definitely, there's that element, like in the future, for example, let's say I have a job at the moment, but if I was to change jobs or something, whether someone might look negatively at it in that way, or let's imagine I start a new relationship with someone, not everybody, I suppose, might be that receptive to it, or their parents might think, oh, that's a bit odd, all stuff that I don't agree with, but these are the anxieties that I have.
I didn't think of that about future jobs. Shit.
Yeah.
Well, it's a bit late now, isn't it? Like...
It's done now, yeah. Me too, it's done now, fuck it, yeah. But do you know what I mean?
It's true. I think I really take that for granted because this is me now. This is 2 books. This is my job. This is what I do. I suppose I really take that aspect for granted. Like, that bit doesn't concern me. It's people who know me, I suppose. Like, there's certain people in my life who I think, oh God, what are they going to think because I've had everything given to me? Well, not given to me, sorry, I don't mean that. I mean, I'm so lucky. I'm from a happy family. I've been able to educate myself. I've had all these opportunities. So like, how dare you? How dare you? You're absolutely pathetic. Think like there's something wrong with your life. That's where I kind of get a bit like. But I think it's because I've been doing it for 7 years now. I don't really get anxious. The one thing that does get to me is, do you know when I was promoting my second book?
Right.
Recently. And I think journalists presume that because you've written about something that they can go straight for the jugular and they can ask you some quite upsetting questions, like kind of, so how many times have you thought about killing yourself? You know, like it's a kind of,
wow. Yeah.
And then after a while, when you kind of hit with it, you're like, I need a break a little, just to give me a break. Can we talk about, I don't know, like an unlikely friendship between a duck and an elephant just for like 2 minutes?
Yeah, exactly. Just to sort of refresh me. Yeah. Yeah. Journalists can be really cutthroat, can't they? So I can imagine that would be quite testing. But yeah, comforting to know from my perspective that as you've been doing it for so long, it kind of just becomes part of you, and those feelings subside. And also not to discourage anyone from sharing their stories publicly, because actually I have to say that my anxieties about it at this stage are just that. They are just anxieties. All of the feedback that I've had from people has been lovely. You know, the messages that I've received since I've started this podcast has all been positive. I've never had somebody say anything negative, you know, at least that I'm aware of anyway. So that's one thing that I would say, you know, not to discourage people from having the courage to talk about these things, because in my experience, it's been all love, really. Has it been the same for you? Have you have you received loads of nice messages over the years, and does that keep you motivated and keep you going, kind of to share your story in the mental health space?
Yeah, 100%. I think, you know, for every awareness campaign when it comes to mental illness, like they're fantastic, they're great, but they're only noise for so long. I really think it's people sharing their stories and their truths that will be the game changer. You know, that's what's going to normalize it if we talk about it. And not just once a year when they do, like HR do a mental health day with a yoga class and a free lunch, or like, well, why don't we, like, let's talk about it. Like when you say you don't feel well, you could say, I actually feel depressed.
Yeah.
I'm really depressed. So it's do you know, when I was interviewing for my book, I worked with a guy who's had a really popular startup, and he's so honest, not just with his employees, but with his investors.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like, that is what's going to change things. Like really sticking your neck out, and like you don't know how people are going to react. You can never really control how people are going to react. Yeah. But personally, you know, me talking about it, I love listening to other people talk about it too. I've been very lucky. It's been wholly very, very positive with me, and it's just, I don't know, I just find it quite galvanizing. I find honesty very galvanizing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree with you. I think the thing that's going to really sort of get rid of this taboo is just more and more people talking about it openly. We just need to normalize it. You know, it is mental health and physical health are one and the same, you know, and they shouldn't be treated differently. So
at that level, I say this like I'm really forthcoming with it. And you're in a meeting when somebody's like, tell me, like, how do you, I'd love it when people tell the truth is in like a proper, like almost coming out way.
Yeah.
And I try and do this more myself, and it's really hard. It's not easy, but I'll be like, can you just give me a minute? I think I'm having a panic attack. Like, just give me 2 minutes. Just give me 2 minutes in a meeting. Yeah. Like, just give me 2 minutes. I don't need to leave or anything. You don't need to be worried.
Yeah.
But rather than pretending like, oh, I just need to do this, or I'm like, no, just say it. That's what's going to change things. If you just say that this is what one looks like, I'll be fine in a minute.
Absolutely. And again, it's such a brave thing to do, because you're not sure how that's going to be received by the people that you're with. But, you know, as you say, the very thing that's going to change it is by people doing stuff like that. So I love that. And one thing I actually wanted to ask you, Claire, was when you're having a panic attack, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a panic attack, just when you're feeling anxious, how do you like people that you're with, be they friends, colleagues, or whatever? How do you like them to talk to you, if at all, when you are feeling quite anxious or when you're about to have a panic attack? What can people do to sort of approach that situation in the right way?
I don't like too much interaction. Like the worst thing you can do for me if I'm panicking or really, really high anxiety is to ask questions like, why do you think this is happening? I'm like, I don't Like, I'm more likely to tear your head off if you try and ask me questions like that when I'm kind of like, I prefer people to be low profile, be there with me, and to sort of say, you know what this is. You've dealt with it before, you can do it again. Like, this is shit. I'm really sorry. Just, I'm right here. You do what you need to do. We've got all the time in the world. You know it'll eventually end. Yeah. And then when it starts coming down a notch or two, if you want to make me laugh, that would be great as well. Or go for a walk. Like, why don't we go for one of my favorite things? Like, because you can panic and walk at the same time. You know, you might as well try and work some of it out that way.
Absolutely, yeah, and I suppose everyone's different as well, you know. But I always like to ask guests that, you know, how they like to be approaching these situations, because I think it's something that, you know, people who are listening who haven't suffered with these things, you know, they can learn a lot from it. You know, for me, it's about when I'm really anxious about something, it's having someone who doesn't suffer with anxiety sort of break down that anxious feeling with me and sort of debunk it, you know, and explain that there's actually no reason to be anxious about that, not in a patronizing way, you know, little by little, and kind of helping them,
like rationalizing it with you.
Yeah, rationalizing it with me in a really constructive way. That helps me personally. So yeah, interesting to see the sort of different approaches there. Claire, you've obviously released your second book, which you mentioned a minute ago, which is called, I think I'm Dying, How I Learned to Live with Panic. And I love the title of this book, and I actually referenced it when I first reached out to you because, you know, as I mentioned before, I have suffered with panic attacks myself, and anybody that knows what they feel, it genuinely does feel like you are dying. You know, your heart rate increases or stops and starts, you sweat, your breath gets shallow, all the rest of it. So it genuinely does feel like you're dying. And I identified with it in a really direct way. So love the title. But yeah, could you talk to us about your decision to write a second book, and also what readers can expect of it? What's the book about, and what can readers get from it?
I started writing it, fully enough, and this is agents for you. This is quite funny. I was just going to write it a couple of years ago. Like, I get really tired of panic and anxiety kind of getting lumped together, as though panic is merely a symptom of anxiety, which it can be. Like, it absolutely can be, but panic is a condition in its own right, and it's violent. Like, that's how I really describe panic attacks. Like, it's not, anxiety builds, like, it builds quite quickly, but panic is rapid. You go from 0 to 100 like that. It demands immediate attention. It will stop you in your tracks. You can't rationalize your way out of it. You kind of just, it's there. And when people would write or talk about it, they would just say, oh, it's a panic attack. I'm like, if you ever had one, and this is nobody's fault, you know, if you've ever had one, it's not just a panic attack. And if nobody's prepared you for how that's going to feel, you absolutely, like you say, think you're going to die.
Yeah.
Or have a stroke. You're like, this is the end. Fuck, I think I'm dying.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try and write about this. Like, I'm going to try and really break it down, but not in a self-helpy way. I'm just going to try and do it. And my agent was like, absolutely not. You are not putting that as a blog post. It's like, okay. He's like, I think there's a real opportunity to really, really do kind of an amazing piece of research with it. So I trusted him. It turns out he was right.
Wow.
And I wanted to write something because perhaps controversially, I don't think there's a cure for panic attacks, because they're not a problem. They're natural. We need them. It's the reason why when you trip on the stairs, you know, you grab hold of something, because your amygdala doesn't need to be told. It just reacts. So it's a good thing. The problem is when there's a miscommunication between the world and the amygdala. You know, the amygdala, because it's been overstressed for so long, now sees things like meetings or public transport as a threat.
Yeah.
When that's a miscommunication. Yeah. And so I kind of just wanted to convey this through a lot of different things that have happened to me and how I learned. Like, there's a lot of self-helpy stuff in there, don't get me wrong, like practical tips. But it's more about how I learned to live with it, not how I cured it. And kind of just to hopefully convey to everybody that, you know, this is not going to ruin your life. You can still live. We can manage this. You know, it's a bit like IBS or eczema. It's not ideal, but, you know, we make it work.
Absolutely. And this is something that I've heard time and time again on this podcast. It's not that, guests come on and they're totally free of the demons they had before. It's learning to live with them in a more healthy way, and you can do that. And I love the two examples that you gave there, physical things, like eczema or asthma, whatever it might be, mental illnesses, is the same as that. So I'm wondering, Claire, sort of in in what headspace you're in now. Is it much better than all of those years ago when you first had that panic attack, and what are some of the things that help you nowadays sort of stay in a positive and sort of healthy mindset?
I can say now that I've never been happier or healthier.
Wow, fantastic.
I think it means a lot for me to say that too. There's so many things I could say. The most important one for me, as I'm going to just bang on about knowledge yet again, I'm a knowledge whore. I really think knowledge is power. If you want, you can learn all the tips in the world. You really can. And mindfulness, yoga, lots of different stuff, like fantastic. Do it. But if you can find out as much as you can that you're comfortable with, in a way, almost in a scientific way, like try and be your own investigator. Learn as much as you can, because it takes some of that fear away. It kind of arms you. I feel like it really is like, it's arming you with this gift of knowledge that you can then, so that's why it's happening. It's completely normal, and there are things that you can do, and then you kind of go from there, really. There's that. And the other one is, it sounds really basic, but be patient. Like, for God's sake, be patient with yourself, particularly because we've been locked in for a year. It's going to be, it might not be, but it might be tricky to go back into what you call normal situations like work, go back to the office, or then going out with friends or with like big groups. It's in the same way that, you wouldn't start, like, do you know what, I'm going to go and run a marathon, like, having had no training. Like, try and think of your brain, give your brain the same respect. Like, I'll just we'll do a little bit first. Like, maybe we'll go to a coffee shop, stay there for 5 minutes, come back, see how it feels. Maybe, and if you get there and you have a bad day with it, like, don't be disheartened. Like, be kind. Like, it's all right. We've got tomorrow. Like, we now know that this is where we're at, but that's okay. It doesn't mean that you've regressed or you've failed or anything.
Knowledge is obviously really important because it helps you to rationalize what you're going through. We spoke about that sort of helping my anxiety a minute ago. So if you understand what's happening in your brain, that can really help. And that's actually something that I've been doing with my therapist recently. We've spoken about the amygdala a lot. I didn't know what that was before, but I do now. And understanding why I feel panic and why I feel anxious and what's actually happening in my brain, that's really helped. And then I totally agree as well, taking baby steps to try and work things out rather than trying to do it all in one go. So some wonderful, very useful bits of advice there, which I think would be very, very helpful for people. Claire, my last question is, you've done so much in the mental health space. You've written 2 books, you've got an amazing blog, you've been interviewed quite a number of times, by top media publications. But is there anything left that you really want to do? Is there anything you really want to achieve in this space? Yeah, if you could tell us about your sort of goals moving forward.
Oh, that's a good question.
I kind of hated myself a bit there. It got a bit job interviewy, didn't it?
I like it.
Tell me about your goals for the
future.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was like, fuck's sake. But yeah, you know what I mean. Is there anything sort of left that you want to achieve in this space?
Sure. Do you know, I just realised I think I've started every answer with sure. So sorry about that. Sure.
No, that's all right. Sure, it's fine.
Sure thing. Panic is a bit of a quest for me. I have thought about doing some kind of courses, teaching in that sphere. So that's that side of it. I really want to continue to develop my blog because that is the foundation of everything for me. So I kind of want to make sure that's the best that it can be. And a little sneaky side project. I really want to write fiction.
Wow, that'd be cool.
I just really want that. That's my kind of bit of a dream, really. I would absolutely love to write fiction. People keep telling me I should because I've got the voice for it, but funnily enough, that would be more vulnerable for me as an experience, then telling people some of the most embarrassing stories about myself, writing fiction is just a bit like singing in public. I'd be like, oh, not writing it, but letting somebody read it. I mean,
Yeah. I think for most people, they'd think it would be the opposite way around, far more easy to write about something that's not true or not about you, but actually for you, it's the other way. That's interesting.
I think what it is, because I outed myself on numerous occasions in very public ways. I'm like, can't get any worse, can it really?
Yeah, it's done now. Yeah. No, but that's really interesting, and we'll definitely have a keen eye on it, on everything that you're hoping to do in the future, and I'll also put the links to both of your books and your blog in the description, because I'm sure listeners can get a lot from all of them. So Claire, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I've learned a lot from it, and I hope listeners have as well. So yeah, thank you very much for taking the time.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
That's it for today's episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it or found it useful. If you did, make sure you hit like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and also that way it makes sure that you never miss an episode. If you've got a story you want to share on the Back on Track podcast, get in touch, give me a shout. I'd love to hear from you via backontrackpod@gmail.com.